Hey guys, welcome to the Bagging Alaska Peaks podcast, episode 4. You know, a big part of this podcast is simply talking to and connecting with climbers from all backgrounds and experiences. From the casual weekend warrior hiker to the more experienced big wall, multi-pitch climbers and mountaineers, and everything in between, this podcast covers it all. Today, I'm really excited to sit down with my wife, Allie, and discuss her experiences in climbing Alaskan peaks. With this episode featuring Lazy Mountain in Palmer, Alaska, Allie expands on her experience in climbing the peak and what she has planned for the near future. In my opinion, already defined as an epic mom and wife, Allie pushed her own physical and mental strength during the climb while also motivating and guiding a 6-year-old, our son, to the 3,740-foot summit. For someone who just enjoys tackling those moderate to difficult climbs, Allie is the epitome of a badass Alaskan mom. You won't want to miss this one. Allie, welcome to the Bagging Alaska Peaks podcast. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing good. Thank you so much for doing this episode 4 with me tonight, in particular talking about Lazy Mountain in Palmer, Alaska, which I'm really excited about. To talk about that one only because I know it's a pretty popular peak to summit among locals here in Alaska. But also this episode in particular, I'm really excited to talk about because my last 3 episodes were with 3 experienced climbers who really like to go high and hard when they climb. And now talking with you, who I can kind of define as more or less a casual hiker, kind of a weekend warrior, if you will. So really the opposite end of the spectrum, talking about climbers and mountaineers who like to hike here in Alaska or summit peak. So, and that's really the premise of this podcast, is talking to people, those really experienced folks, and again, those more casual weekend warrior hikers, if you will, and everything in between. So really excited to talk about that. And again, thank you again for taking the time tonight to chat with me, even though you're married to me and you live with me. So thanks again for taking the time to do that.
Of course.
Yeah, so again, talking about Lazy Mountain today, a pretty popular peak here in the Chugach Mountain Range to climb, with some great views of a lot of cool peaks, which we're going to talk to here shortly. But before we get into talking about the peak itself and your particular summit day, I want to kind of open it up to you and talk about how you and I met each other, and then talk to how you started climbing and getting into that piece and how you ended up here in Alaska. So if you could spend a few minutes briefly talking about that.
Sure. So as you just mentioned, well, we are married. We are high school sweethearts.
Happily married over how many years now?
Oh gosh. 13 years, maybe?
13. That puts you on the spot with that question.
You did. It'll be 14 years this fall. But anyway.
14 years, nice.
But we've been together for 20 years.
Yeah, long time.
Yes. Shocking, right? Okay. So, that's how we met. We are high school sweethearts. We're both military brats. So we met in Virginia. Mm-hmm. And both coming from military families. You went into the military before we got married. So that's how I made it here to Alaska. Fun fact, I did live here in Alaska back in the 90s with my dad in the Army. So coming back to the same military installation 25 years later has been kind of cool to experience, and just experiencing it through, new eyes, new age, new family has been really awesome.
Yeah, it's kind of neat to experience it, as you mentioned, in a completely different lens, right? Because when you were here last, you were younger, probably didn't get out and do anything too crazy, but you were pretty adventurous growing up, from what I remember you talking
active,
about.
Different kind of active.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, different lens, and linking up with some old friends too that you grew up with here, and now you get to hang out with again, which is pretty neat.
Back in action. Yep. But as far as my experience with climbing, you already mentioned I'm, as we're calling it, a casual hiker, because that's pretty much what I am. I am not your typical mountaineer that you kind of experience here in Alaska, but like to be outdoors, enjoy the hiking, and I enjoy a challenge. So where it kind of, I don't know where it started. I mean, I've always enjoyed the outdoors. You and I have always gravitated to that over all the years we've been together. Climbing specifically, first dabbled in it when I lived here as a kid. We dabbled in it just barely, when we were together in high school. But you jumped into it once we graduated high school, and then our first duty station in Delaware is where you and I really made it kind of a regular routine for us when we would go up to Bear, Delaware, and go to this wonderful rock climbing gym they had there.
Yeah, do you remember what it was called? I don't, off the top of my head.
I do not. I think it's something very generic, like Delaware Rock Gym or something.
Oh, maybe it was. Yeah, maybe it was. It was a really nice indoor gym, though. And like
really
you said,
good.
we made it. We did it pretty consistently for a while.
Yep,
there in
enjoyed it.
Delaware.
But I stayed on the inside. You did a little bit of bouldering outside. I stuck to the walls inside the building. But definitely enjoyed it and built some good core strength at that point in our lives. Moves took us elsewhere, and focuses in life took us elsewhere for a little while, and we kind of got out of that depending on where we lived and what was going on in our lives. But obviously coming back here to Alaska, it's started over. For me, at least. It never really ended for you, but it's kind of just starting back up for me. So
yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned kind of the different places that we've been, and I think I've talked about it before, but like most of my climbing and hiking and yours has been on the East Coast, right? Compared to an epic place like Alaska now, that the accessibility of some incredible peaks and mountains either to hike or climb is really endless out here, which is pretty amazing. So obviously, we'll be doing a lot more here compared to a place such as Delaware, right?
Oh, so yes.
Yeah. So you mentioned how you ended up here in Alaska, right? Moving with the military. So that's essentially how we got here. Yeah. What type of so we talked a little bit about climbing, and you alluded to a little bit hiking. What's your hiking experience? What would you say your hiking experience is from when you started really on the East Coast?
Yeah, I would say easy to moderate is kind of where we had been all over the years, because we never really planned like massive trips out to go hiking. It was mostly quick day trips when we would find the time for it, because most of it was, driving the first part of the day, doing a nice hike, and then driving back to wherever we were on the East Coast at the time. So it really was just priorities and our I don't know, our dedication to the climate, I guess, which is different here, because here you still do the drive, but it's just such a different experience and terrain and environment to hike and climb in. So, and also depending on where you're at, you only had a certain, I think, variation of how difficult it could be. Obviously, if we keep bringing up the East Coast because that's where we spent most of our time. The Smokies, the Appalachian, they have good treacherous hikes, but the peaks aren't quite like what they are here. So you're just going to have different elevation. Granted, they'll still have different challenges for you. And it also depends on your, your endurance level. Like some of us, my endurance level is much lower than yours. And just being able to carry on as long as you. So it just depends on your strength, your health, or just your level of fitness for certain climbs and whatnot too. So.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, right? The availability. So yeah, we've always been gravitated towards outdoor activities such as hiking and climbing. But you bring up a good point, at least where we've been so far in our lives, moving around with the military and personally, the availability of terrain in reality has been somewhat limited based off of where we've been, right? So just a few examples. Delaware doesn't have much at all. So you've got to drive to get to some places. Oklahoma, where we just came from, has very little as well. Kind of out west, the Wichita Wildlife Refuge there is probably the only place with terrain. I think the highest peak out there is just around 2,000 feet, and that's literally the highest peak. So
we spent some time in North Carolina, which was fantastic, but we were closer to the east side of the state, whereas, the mountains where you want to be are clearly in the western part of the state. So you did have to drive. It wasn't just, 20 minutes down the Glen and you could find a peak to climb like here.
Yeah, and I've mentioned it in some other episodes too, like the Chugach, mountain range out here is just, it's in our backyard, and the peaks that you can climb are ultimately endless, which is pretty insane. But yeah, so that's good to hear your experience again, talking geared towards that casual hiker, if you will, right? And again, I'm really excited to kind of feature this experience level in an episode, because my last 3 have been pretty experienced people. So again, what this podcast really revolves around is talking to those everyday people, whether you're really experienced or just that weekend warrior. So really excited to get into that. Yeah, so it's good to hear kind of your background. So let's go ahead and get into the peak itself. Let's talk about Lazy Mountain for a few minutes. Again, as I mentioned kind of in the opening here, pretty popular peak to climb, right? The accessibility is fairly easy. The ascent for the most part is pretty easy for a casual hiker. So if you could take a few minutes to talk about Lazy Mountain in general, like where it sits, what mountain range, maybe the elevation and the access to that particular trailhead.
Okay, sure. So Lazy, we found ourselves in Palmer. So right over there in the valley, I don't know, 40-ish minute drive, maybe 45, because you got to go a little further to get to the trailhead. But again, it's in Palmer. The trailhead was pretty aptly named Lazy Mountain Trailhead Parking, which was over by East Huntley Road to Mountain Trail Circle. There's a pretty decent sized parking lot.
Yeah, it is.
It is, there is a parking fee. So if you don't have the specific pass for that type of trail, because there's various passes for all the trails around here, you'll have to pay for day parking. There's a decent bathroom at the trailhead. Not a porta potty. It's your typical, little brick house of a toilet.
Yeah, so if you need to unload before you head up, that's the way to do it.
Absolutely. But yeah.
What's the so the trailhead parking, as you mentioned, which is pretty accessible, pretty large parking area. What's the elevation of Lazy Mountain? Do you remember what that peak sits at?
It's about 3,700 feet.
Yeah, 36 to 3,700, depending on where you get your data. I think All Trails says around 36, and some other platforms say around 37. So, not a crazy summit, but definitely a good push for sure. And from what I remember, there's 2 particular routes that you can take to summit Lazy Mountain. Can you talk to those 2 routes?
Sure. Pretty early on, like barely a few steps onto the trail, you'll see that the trail does split. There will be a map there. So you can go on the Lazy Mountain Trail. And for anybody who's listening to this that hasn't done Lazy Mountain, do not think it is for the lazy. So the Lazy Mountain Trail is the one that goes a little bit more of a direct shot to the summit. It's a shorter trail and it's a steeper trail. And the Lazy Moose Trail will take you a longer route, so you can weave your way up the mountain a little bit better without as steep of climbs or ascends if you take that route. It does kind of split off. One of them you almost cut off to the left a little bit, or almost go straight if my memory serves. And then the moose one, you veer off to the right and you kind of make your way around and up, if that's the way you go. So there's 2 primary routes. I think there's really the only 2 routes, unless you decide to come up on the back end. I think there may be a trail that you can take to Lazy Mountain from Matanuska. But that's like if you're through hiking or something like that. But sorry to cut you off. Go ahead. That's okay. On our way up, we did choose to take the Lazy Mountain Trail.
Yep.
And we chose to take the Lazy Moose Trail on the way down, which we'll kind of get to that, I'm sure, in just a moment.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. So again, two routes that you can take. Do you remember how long did you mention that Lazy Mountain Trail to the summit, if you decided to kind of take
Sure.
that route?
Yeah, so the Lazy Mountain Trail is a 2 miles to the summit versus the Lazy Moose Trail that takes you around a little bit, which is a 3.5 mile trek up to the summit. So it's a pretty significant difference in my opinion. Being a casual hiker here, in my opinion, cutting off 1.5 miles to go straight up the mountain to me is a big number. But
Yeah. Yeah, and something definitely to consider, right? If you are indeed a casual hiker, or not familiar or comfortable with steeper terrain, because the Lazy Mountain Trail does have some pretty steep portions in it, and we'll talk to that here in a second. But yeah, if you're going up with maybe smaller children, maybe the Lazy Moose Trail is a better option. And while I'm on the children piece, forgot to mention that it wasn't just myself and you. Who else did we take with us?
We took our son Landon. He was about 6.5 when we made our way up Lazy Mountain.
Yeah, 6.5 years old, and did a fantastic job. And we'll talk to that piece a little bit later too. But yeah, just a plug for our 6-year-old son. He's a stud when it comes to climbing. So he's done some pretty cool hikes. But again, for those who haven't done Lazy Mountain and may want to with younger children, you do have two options, whether that's a steep ascent or less steep, if you will. Just consider the distance that you add on to that piece. So. Yeah, cool. So we talked a little bit about the access to Lazy Mountain, the trailhead itself, and the two routes that you can take. So let's get into your particular summit day, and let's talk to that piece. Maybe touch on the overall weather that you had that day, the time of year you climbed it, the trail conditions, and maybe some gear list options that you took with you.
Sure. So when we did Lazy, it was mid-August. So it was the weekend the kids started school was the weekend that we climbed Lazy. So it was kind of fall, I guess is about what you would say here in August. It's fall. So once we left, which we started hiking around between 11 and 11:30 in the morning. Can't pinpoint it exactly. So there was a small chill. Like for myself, I had a long sleeve shirt and I think a sweatshirt on. You might have had something thin on and you stripped rather quickly. It didn't take me too long, nor just the day to start heating up quickly. So like I said, there's a small chill in the air when we started, and then it warmed up, both just because the day was warming up quickly and because I was hoofing it up the hill, up the mountain. So it was slightly overcast, if I remember, when we started, and I think the clouds were in and out on our way up for like the first half, because I just feel like I remember there being some overcast, but I also remember there being some sun shining on us, on and off. The trail does start off with you kind of in the woods, and then it breaks out a little bit, and some thick brush. I can't even tell you what it was. Maybe it was a whole bunch of Devil's Club everywhere with the
there may have been some up there, but yeah, you're right. You're definitely under the canopy for a while, but then you start breaking out of that. Kind of the high vegetation, if you will. Then it starts hitting up that tundra-ish, and then ridgeline, right?
Yep. So, I don't know how far we got up. There's kind of as you're going up, and I might be getting ahead of myself, but when you're going up the trail, I think there's a trail marker, maybe on one of the signs, or maybe it's just something that people say, kind of halfway up, there's a picnic table. So you're just kind of trying to make it to the picnic table. First of all, for myself, to be able to say, all right, I made it halfway, but also to keep our 6-year-old going. Food is a massive incentive for him, food and snacks. So like, hey, when we get to this picnic table, which is halfway up, we'll be able to eat lunch. We just got to keep going. We're almost there. So that was kind of our obviously our first goal, was to get to that darn picnic table. But before we get to the picnic table, it was a pretty quiet trail for us. I don't know if there was a rhyme or reason, but there was not a ton of people on that trail. It was the middle of the day when we were going. unless everybody else had already gotten an earlier start, and we were
Maybe.
just kind of trailing behind them because there were a decent amount of vehicles there, but we didn't really see many people on our way, at least to the picnic table.
Yeah, it was pretty quiet for the most part. Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned the picnic tables because a lot of hikes around here, excuse me, and that we've done so far typically have, picnic table at a certain point, right? Yeah, or a bench, right? And you kind of mentioned how that's kind of a goal or shooting point for most people to kind of at least get to that point and then keep moving on, right?
Yep.
So, yeah, you talked to the weather. What about the trail conditions? Let's talk a little bit about that particular day and time of year.
So the trail conditions kind of really switched once we got to the picnic table. So the first half we mentioned we were under a canopy, so there wasn't a ton of grass that we were, hiking on because we're underneath trees and roots and just a bunch of dirt. At one point there was lots of vegetation surrounding us and no trees. So it was kind of like downed vegetation cutting through the path. And then we came back up to more trees and roots, and in that part it was damp under there, but it wasn't like we were trudging through inches of mud. It was damp enough to where when we were going up some of the steeper parts, because it wasn't strictly uphill, but you would get a couple of moments where you'd get a little bit of a flat reprieve, and then you'd shoot right back up, like almost straight up. That might be a little bit, over exaggeration there, but for my casual hiking experience, you would be shooting straight up for a couple moments, and it would be slippery, and it'd be slippery not necessarily just because it was just such slick mud. It was just so steep, and there wasn't much to grab onto, and we did not have cleats on.
Yeah, we didn't have micro spikes this day at all.
We did have trekking poles,
That's
and they
right.
did
Yep.
help some. But yeah, some of the spots, you'd kind of try to kind of grab on a tree or go out to the side of the trail where less people had foot traffic, so you might have a little bit more traction to, climb up there. So that was fun. And I don't say that lightly. It was fun. It was.
Yeah, and again, right, keep in mind too, we've got a 6-year-old with us that's trying to do the same thing. So, when mom and dad are slipping everywhere on this portion of the trail, you've got a 6-year-old that you're trying to keep up as well. And not to mention, we saw a hiker that was heading down kind of during that steeper section. You remember what happened to him?
Yep, one of them.
Older gentleman.
Yeah, he was an older gentleman. And I think he had a dog with him. He wasn't holding on to the dog, so it's not because a dog pulled him, but he was slowly going down, low center of gravity, and he ended up slipping, and he just kind of slid all the way down this hill. And I say all the way down this hill. He wasn't sliding down the mountain, but it was probably a good 10 to 15 feet, and he was a little older.
Yeah, I would say it was a little bit longer than that, actually. Like he went for a good ride for sure.
Yeah, well, but he got up and said he was just fine, and I imagine if he's up there hiking Lazy Mountain, he's pretty darn fit in his age.
Yeah.
But it was just it was steep. And for you and I to be climbing up it was one thing. For Landon to be going up it, him at 6.5, his coordination isn't quite there, but his endurance is there. So, him climbing up like a little monkey in some spots, but then other spots where it's a little sketchy, then he needed a little boost from dad from behind or something. But we made it up, and it was like that when you were when you were in the woods. And I don't think we really had super steep, like we're on all fours kind of thing trying to get up the hill once we got
at all.
out from underneath the canopy.
Yeah, not Lazy Mountain. But yeah, that was probably the more steeper, more difficult portion, if you will. Again, because of its the condition of the trail, it was wet / slippery, if you will. And again, kind of going back to the having a 6-year-old with us. So yeah, so we broke out of the canopy, and then we essentially get on the ridge line. The ridge line, for me, anytime I get up out of the canopy and start hitting that ridge line towards the summit, the ridge lines always seem to take forever, but they have like the best views. Do you remember, did we have any false summits that you remember?
We had about 3. Yes. Because I also, I go on these hikes with you, and you are the mastermind behind all of them. Like, Landon and I show up for the ride, for the experience. You do the planning. If let me know what kind of snacks I can get, if there's anything I can put in the vehicle as we hit the road. But you look at the trail, and I do not. So, which is kind of to my benefit, I think, because then I just don't know what's in store, and I'm excited to go regardless. But I feel like if personally for me, if I looked at the trail and how long it is ahead of time, I would get in my mind about how far I have to go rather than I'm just going.
That's a mental game for a lot of people, right?
Yeah. And so for me, like, we'd get to one spot, I'm like, oh, that's got to be it. Well, it's right there. Look, finally, like, I can take a deep breath right now out of my, fast beating heart over here trying to keep up with Sean the Great. And then we get up there, I'm like, oh, that was great. And that's a nice, continued trail. We'll just keep on going.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
There were a few.
It's funny you mentioned that too, because we were just talking the other day about how Landon did POW MIA or Gold Star Peak.
Yeah.
And that particular hike, not to veer off course too much, but that particular hike, the entire ascent we were pretty much in the fog, socked in the entire time. And now looking back, right, at least with, again, doing it with a 6-year-old, a kid,
I'm so glad.
It was almost better that we couldn't see the steep terrain that we were going into, because that may have played a big mental game on not only him, but I think us as parents too, right? With us being that first time we were summiting Gold Star Peak at that time, we could have looked up and been like, all right, I'm not sure we want to bring Landon up this, but...
Yeah, it was our first time up that peak, but really, it was like Landon and I, and maybe even yours, like, first time up, like, a real peak, period.
Yeah, that's true. Right when we first got here.
So, yeah, we weren't woefully prepared. Well, I don't want to say prepared. Like, we had all the things we needed, except for those trekking poles. But, right. Like, knowing what... when you say a certain elevation, we hadn't been at those elevations to really like put into perspective how long we're going to be on this trail and how tough it's really going to be. So we didn't, that was really our first experience. So that was helpful. We were socked in. This one, we weren't socked in. It's just, you'd get to one little mini summit and then you realize that you're going to keep going. And so I think there were about 2 or 3 of them, which was fine. But it was just kind of like, okay, well, there's my next goal,
Yeah, I remember a few fall summits too, which obviously at Lazy Mountain, you've got service and stuff, so you can definitely refer to whatever app that you're using. But I think I remember a hiker passing us asking if that was the summit, right? And we said no. But I can't remember if that individual turned around.
Because we saw that there was another one, but we thought that second one was it, and that second one was not it.
Yeah, so definitely be prepared for some fall summits out there if you've never done Lazy Mountain. Because it could definitely play with your mind a little bit.
Or just play with your time. If you have a certain schedule that you're trying to keep to.
Yeah, but overall, as we kind of mentioned, up on the ridgeline, the ridgeline itself, the trail is pretty easy to follow all the way to the summit there. And you're exposed to the hot sun here in Alaska. But it was pretty warm that day, actually.
Warm. Yeah, it started off a little bit overcast. It was like partly sunny, partly cloudy. But I think by the time we started getting to the ridgeline, there was few clouds left.
Yeah.
It was A beautiful, clear day, and you could see both sides.
Yep. So you mentioned, you talked a little bit about gear. Again, if you can just touch on, again, the gear that we had with us and maybe some things, if anything, you wished you did have with you that day that we didn't take.
Sure. So some of the things we already mentioned would be the trekking poles. And I think that's one thing we learned rather quickly, that it's better to have them than to not have them. So if you brought them and you don't need them, cool. Plug them into the back of your backpack. But trekking poles, yes. On that hike, it definitely would have been helpful to have cleats with those steep parts. Like I said, you weren't trudging through thick mud. It was just so steep that it was really hard to get purchase on the ground as you were going up in some areas.
Yeah, I always, and I've mentioned this, I think, in a few episodes, but I always bring micro spikes, whether I know it's going to be wet, if it's going to be dry. Just I've put them on before in dry conditions, and I just feel more secure going up steeper stuff if I need to with micro spikes.
Yeah,
So
they're so small that why not?
yeah.
Um, so another thing, obviously water. And with the three of us hiking, we end up chugging some good water. So I would say if you plan on bringing 2 bottles, maybe bring 3. Just so that way you don't have to ration. If you're not going on such a strenuous hike that you have the space for it, or it's just not too much to carry, why not?
Yeah, that's good to know, because there are a lot of trails and routes up here where you can replenish just from natural sources.
Yeah, there's
for Lazy Mountain, you cannot. So definitely be prepared for that. Again, especially with younger children, if you decide to do it.
Yeah, because I mean, it's one thing for us to understand to ration water, but a 6.5-year-old doesn't have that same thought process when they're chugging their water, and I don't want to tell them, no more water, you can't drink.
Yep, or chugging water and decides to set the water down and leave the cap off, and getting all crazy. That's what kids do.
Yeah. So one more thing, just for any parent hiking with a kiddo, that is a fun thing for us that we use quite often for Landon is like Jolly Ranchers as an incentive. Because sometimes either just the hiking is just monotonous for them, or they've lost interest for just a short amount of time. We're like, all right, in 2 more minutes, we'll give you a Jolly Rancher. So like any little thing sometimes, a lot of kids would be perfectly fine with it. Some kids just need a little something here and there. And sometimes when we can tell he's starting to get like, all right, when's something exciting going to happen? We will bring a Jolly Rancher out of the pocket, and it just saves the day for the next short amount of time, which seems so small, but sometimes something so small can be so big.
Yeah, and you say, you talk to how that's a good motivation for kids and Landon, which it is, but even for adults, right? Getting that good sugar dose when you need it, stuff like that. So, which experienced climbers, you all know this, but again, for some of the smaller kids, you definitely need to motivate them somehow. And Jolly Ranchers is what we found has worked. So, yeah. So let's talk to kind of finishing up there. So you get on the ridgeline, and then you essentially hit the summit of Lazy Mountain. So if you can speak to that a little bit, and also touch on kind of going back to the gear piece as well, maybe some things you would want up there with the youngster.
Yep. So once you get to the summit is very much on a rocky peak. So you have like a small area where you could safely stand, and not necessarily right on top of rocks, but you have a comfortable place to stand if there's a small group of you that want to take pictures. But otherwise, you'll be climbing on some rocks there at the very top. So for us, hiking with a 6.5-year-old, a harness is most certainly something that we always have it in our packs when he's with us. So Sean hooked up to Landon, and so that way they could go to the tippy top, the true summit.
Yeah, the most prominent point. Yeah.
Walking up there with the two of them harnessed together. And I would say, again, if you can swing it, which for safety we should all swing it, but a helmet wouldn't be a bad thing to have on this one. We did not have a helmet on this trip, but looking back, once we got to the top and just seeing that it was rocky, it wasn't like, walking on this really thin ridge line that, you had to be very, very careful. You certainly had to be careful, and it was a little sketchy. It was definitely sketchy for a 6-year-old, but I would bring a helmet.
Yeah, helmets, again, I keep saying that I talk about this during previous episodes, but yeah, helmets are one of those things that you just, in my opinion, you just always have hooked up to your backpack, right? Because I think John on episode 1, he mentioned it, right? You can always have rock falls. So when you're climbing up, right, you can have a rock that comes down and nails you in the head, right? You definitely want to protect that for sure. So, yeah, and for kids too, right? And something I'm going to emphasize that you mentioned, right, is when you're climbing up some of these prominent peaks, and Lazy Mountain obviously being the example today, definitely had some steep drop-offs. at the actual summit. So, if mom or dad can have a harness and the kid has a harness and you're hooked up with a sling or rope, whatever, highly recommend that. And that's typically our go-to is dad, myself, I'll have a harness on. Excuse me, Landon will have a harness and we'll have a sling, a pretty long sling hooked up to him. Because you just never know, right? Kids are reckless. They don't really pay attention to where they're walking, etc. So,
Yep. Also at the top there is an American flag. So good picture moment. When you get to
a box as well, or what we call geocaches for Landon, right? Which is pretty motivating for him.
Yeah. It was like one of those like ammo
cans
or something with a whole bunch of goodies and nice, neat things to look at. But once you get up there, you're pretty much overlooking Palmer. You can see because I mentioned the time that we were up there, we were there mid-August, so we could see the fairgrounds and you could hear everything going on at the fairgrounds.
That's right.
But then you look the other direction, you're just looking at the range, and what's the peak right there,
Matanuska.
Yep. Yeah, you're staring right at Matanuska when you turn the other direction. So it's just fantastic views both ways. You're looking one way at Palmer, and then also technically the inlet, and the other one you're just looking down the range, and it's beautiful. You have literally a 180-degree view of something, and it was beautiful. The time we spent at the very true summit was rather short. Do you remember why?
Yeah, I think so, which kind of leads me into like what are some highs and lows during that particular summit of yours, and I would assume this is going to be a low for you.
It wasn't even that low of a low because it was unexpected and comical. So we got to the peak, and because I have not summited too many peaks, I did not know that there were going to be thousands of flies, bugs, swarming you everywhere. So we got to the top, and as we were climbing to the top of this, like from where you could stand to where you, as I'm giving air quotes, climb to the very top, like you're just crawling on your hands and knees. For me, myself, I think
a little bit of scrambling, just
a little bit for like a short amount of distance,
not much at all.
Just a less than 30 feet probably. As you're getting up there, you're realizing every step you take, there are more and more bugs. And so we stood up there for a minute to take a picture, but we could only smile for so long because the bugs were kind of flying in your eyes. They're flying up your nose, coming at your teeth as we were trying to smile for pictures. So it was comical. It was unexpected. And so I went down, and I think the boys stayed up there for like another 30 seconds to a minute, and then they followed right behind me. So that was
it was interesting because I think I haven't been on a peak since then, or even before, that had so many bugs, which was really, really odd. So I don't know if it was just that peak or that time of year or what, but it was really interesting. Yeah, I think we have a video actually, like a 360 like drone video of you kind of swatting all the bugs, which is pretty funny. So Lazy Mountain, excuse me. Really neat, pretty quick summit that you can do in a day. You remember how long it took us to do that? How many hours?
Yeah, up and down it took us about 6. And I want to clarify for any casual hikers that are listening to this podcast that Sean mentioned at the beginning that is a relatively easy hike for a casual hiker. It was tough. It was a challenge for me. There were plenty of times where, you would have some flat ground to hike on, but there were a lot of ups on this hike. Nothing that you can't do as a casual hiker. You just have to be prepared to challenge yourself. Because I thought it was tough. It was a good hike to go on, and I would absolutely do it again, but it was tough for me.
Yeah.
For me, it was.
Yeah, and again, really talking to the two routes, right, that you could do, the Lazy Mountain or the Lazy Moose. But regardless, those two end up meeting at the same point. So you're still going to have to do the same ridgeline, right? Yeah. So it's not like one's necessarily easier, maybe for a little bit of the trail. But
so I don't think I had any lows on the hike. I had challenges on the hike, which was the hike itself.
Yeah.
But I don't personally think that there were any lows for us. There were no injuries. The weather was great, so there wasn't really a low for me. It was just a challenge, which that's not a low. We did go down the mountain. The on the Lazy Moose Trail. And another thing that was kind of a high, but also like a little, okay, let's watch out. We did see a bull moose on our way down.
Oh, that's right.
And so as we saw him, because my head was on a spindle as we were coming down this trail, just because I was prepared to see an animal. First of all, I'm always looking because I want to see an animal. But then when I'm like also thinking, okay, if there's a moose, what's the closest tree for us to get behind? But as we were going down, we're kind of, doing a lot of hairpin turns down. And I look up, and at the trail where we had just been less than a minute ago, there was a bull moose on the trail. And we're like, oh, okay, there's a moose right up there. And he was looking right at us. So we were just kind of cautiously kept going, kept making all the noise and conversations and singing along that we were doing, all the while still watching him. And we saw him start to run. So we got a little nervous, but he just kept running down the trail. But he didn't do the hairpin turn and come down. He just kept going off into the woods at that point. So that's when we were like, all right, continue to make noise, but also continue to be vigilant, because we saw a moose on Lazy Moose. So
yeah, yeah, I totally forgot about that. But yeah, and seeing a moose run that close, like it's even to this day, because we've seen a few, but even to this day, like it's absolutely amazing the strength and power those things have. So again, kind of going back to hiking with smaller children, like always be ready to find that big tree to stand behind on Lazy Moose Trail if you're going down it, because there's definitely a possibility. So yeah, so again, thanks for sharing the kind of your summit day of Lazy Mountain, and talking to the overall trail conditions that we experienced and the route itself. Then of course getting to the summit. And as you mentioned, right, if you get a good day, you've got some really incredible views of Matanuska, Palmer, and everything really beyond that, if you can get a really clear day. So definitely a great hike. Again, for the casual hiker, still a challenging peak, as most peaks here in Alaska will probably be. But thanks for sharing your experience with that.
Absolutely.
If you find yourself still hungry for more mountaineering stories and networking, consider checking out the Mountaineering Club of Alaska, or MCA for short. Founded in 1958, the MCA is a nonprofit organization that is focused on promoting mountaineering, hiking, climbing, skiing, and the preservation of the outdoors and wilderness. The MCA is also active in promoting conservation, trail maintenance, and vital in preserving some of the mountaineering history and place names within Alaska. Additionally, they are the primary organization that manages and maintains 8 backcountry huts available to the public. If you would like more information about joining the club and or volunteering, visit the website at mtnclubak.org. So I want to go ahead and transition now into what this podcast, what I like this podcast to kind of revolve around on the back end after talking about the peak, and that's the physical, mental, and spiritual journey of mountaineering or hiking, I think in this case. So what can you talk to, you don't have to talk to all 3 of those, but if you can pick one of those elements to talk to and how that kind of relates to you.
Can I pick 2?
Sure.
So for me, being a casual hiker, it appeals to me for physical and mental aspects, because like I mentioned, it's a mental game for me to make it up that mountain, to number one, challenge myself to do something that I know isn't going to be easy for me and for my skill level, and to make myself, honestly, I'm very proud of myself when I get to that mountain, because it's the challenge for me on the ones that we've done is more significant than, the challenge for you, because you're just more experienced. You do it a little bit more than I do. It's a mental win for me when I get to the top. I might be huffing and puffing my whole way up there, trying to just fighting for my life to stay alive on some of these ascents and everything. But when I get to the top, I'm so proud that I accomplished it, first of all. And then I'm just happy to be up there, because it's just beautiful. Most of the ones that we've gone up, I say most because the very first one we did, which was just the biggest challenge I think I've had, you couldn't see anything. because we were so socked in.
Right.
Lazy, we could see everything, and it's just beautiful. So mentally, I'm proud of myself for accomplishing those types of things, because it's not every day. I mean, for a lot of people in Alaska, they would say absolutely it is an everyday thing, but not for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously physical. It's a physical challenge for, I would say, most anyone to just climb a mountain. Sure, I know we have all different experience levels and steepness and elevation levels, but I can't imagine it's just like walking down the street for anyone. So definitely a physical challenge, which is great, because that's something that I would like to do more of. I would like to challenge myself physically on a regular basis anyway. So those are the two for me that it hits and it impacts.
Yeah, it's good to hear. So you mentioned the physical piece, right? And obviously a lot of these peaks out here in Alaska are physically demanding. It hurts going up them. It hurts going down them. So I guess my next question for you then is, what keeps you going back to them? Like, why do you continue to do it, right? Because I've heard people talk about it before and ask those questions, right? Like, hey, as difficult as it is, why do you want to go through that pain, right? From folks, right, who probably aren't familiar with why we do it, right? So what keeps you going back?
Well, I don't know. There's a lot of things that keep me going back. Like I said, the physical challenge, I enjoy the physical challenge, it's a way to exercise without being, mundane on a treadmill, just running in one spot, looking at a screen. Like I'm climbing a mountain, I'm hiking a trail, and I'm looking at all this beautiful nature around me. I'm having conversations with my family. I'm singing ridiculous songs going down a trail with my 6-year-old son. And then on the flip side, when we're not in those moments and I'm not talking, it's because I'm trying to, make sure my feet are still below me. So I'm making sure I'm still breathing as I'm trying to go up. So it's just a good challenge to, it's a goal to stay physically fit, I would imagine, for most people. So for that aspect, but then just, again, I mentioned for mental, like, I know how thankful I am that I chose to do the hike once I've made it to the top. Like I'm just so proud that I did it. So like, why not want to have that feeling again?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned kind of getting away, or essentially we have the biggest gym in our backyard, right? If you think about it, and who wouldn't want to replace an indoor gym / treadmill style workout with climbing some epic peaks in Alaska. I know I would.
Obviously not every workout, but
yeah, absolutely. But
for me,
yeah, absolutely right. So physical and mental challenge. That's interesting to hear your perspective again, coming from that kind of opposite end of the spectrum from what I've been talking about, kind of the last 3 episodes. That's really neat to hear. So what's next for you? Do you have a specific summit, peak, or trip that you would love to do next?
Whatever you sign us up for, dear.
Whatever I sign us up.
No.
Denali?
I'm gonna let you handle Denali. I'll stay here with the kiddo. But no, one that I've mentioned a couple times, I mentioned to you that would be fun, and it would be a challenge, would be to not only hike flat top but camp out up there. Like that would be a big challenge for me, knowing that the last time I tried to sleep in a tent, it did not go well. And then doing it on top of a mountain with the wind and the elements, that would be something that I would think is really neat to do, and I would impress myself.
Yeah, we almost did it during this last winter solstice. So, but I think, and we were actually going to bring Landon with us. However, we ended up canceling, I think, due to weather, which I think was a good decision because my buddy Andrew, who I just did an episode with, I think he posted a video of a flat top during that day, and it was a pretty gnarly day. So I think we made a good decision.
Part of that decision to cancel was based on Landon. It's one thing for us to tough it out and being comfortable with being uncomfortable. But we should probably ease him into it a little differently.
Yeah, the kiddos definitely have a vote in that decision making for sure. But yeah, that'd be a really neat one to do. Maybe we get a babysitter sometime, and you and I just go up there and do that. We'll see what happens. Well, cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing the physical and mental piece of mountaineering or hiking for you. It's always good to hear that perspective from all the guests, and of course someone who's kind of that weekend warrior, as we've mentioned a few times. So, last few questions before we close this up. First one is, do you have any mountaineering quotes or sayings that you kind of rely on for getting up peaks or anything like that, or just one that you like?
Nike, just do it. No, I'm just kidding. I don't.
Just do it.
I don't have a favorite quote. So what's your favorite quote?
My favorite quote.
Yes.
My favorite quote. I've got a lot of favorite quotes. I actually have a book of quotes that I keep with me. Actually, a buddy of mine that I'm in the military with, we exchange quotes all the time. Most of them have to do with the outdoors, but one that I stumbled across, I don't know, maybe 6 to 8 months ago, which I found really interesting was, and again, I don't know the official source of it, but the quote is, "Don't climb mountains for people to see you, climb mountains for you to see the world." And that resonated with me only because this day and age, and I'm including myself in it, right? We're always out there trying to get the best shot for social media, Instagram, etc. So I think that one in particular for me, you have to challenge yourself. I think, again, with social media, you have to challenge yourself every so often to go out and do some of these peaks and almost like leave that stuff behind. Like, just go up there and do it for yourself, right? So don't climb the mountains for necessarily Instagram, but climb it so you can see the world, right? And I think here in Alaska is a great example of going up on some of these big peaks and just taking the time to soak all that in. So it's a solid one, which I really like.
It's a good one.
So thanks for asking me that question, throwing a 180 on me, throwing that back in my court, if you will. All right, last question I got for you, and we'll close this one up. And again, I wanted to ask this question because it's obviously relevant for, I'm sure, a lot of people here in Alaska, and of course your particular summit on Lazy Mountain. So the question is, if you could leave any advice or share any advice to folks out there that like to climb or would like to climb with small children, what would that be?
Don't be afraid to do it.
I like it.
I think folks there's plenty of people out there who will hike and do these types of things with young kids. I've seen it. We're not the only ones out there, but I have a sneaky suspicion that there's plenty of people out there who will talk themselves out of it because, number one, they're afraid it might be too tough for their child, or their kiddo won't like it, or maybe it's not safe. So if it's not safe, that's a different concern. If you don't think it's safe for you, for your family, sure, find something different to do that doesn't put your family's safety in jeopardy. But if you don't think they're gonna like it, you won't know until you try it. And one hike might be very different from another hike. So I would also not do a one and done. Give it some time. Prepare them, show them exciting things, pictures or something. I'm not sure. But just don't be afraid to do it because they're not going to like it. And as far as if it's too hard for them, again, you won't know until you try it. Because they surprise you. They have so much more energy than we have.
Mm-hmm.
So something that you might think is going to be really tough might be tough, but half of these hikes, Lanny kicks my own butt going up these hills because they're so young, so energetic, and they have so much more stamina.
And resilient, obviously. Yeah. Kids are definitely resilient.
They're not afraid to get dirty. Well, most of them aren't afraid to get dirty, so there's that. But I would just say, just get out there and do it because you won't know unless you try. And if they tried it once and you've waited a little bit, try it again. They're growing, they're maturing. They're finding different things exciting, finding different things interesting at different points in their lives, and make it exciting for them. Like if you're super excited to go, that energy rubs off on them. So then they'll become super excited to go. Make it sound like it's the coolest thing since sliced bread. Sometimes is what you have to do. But just do it.
Yeah, no, I like it. Don't be afraid to do it. And, I think, that advice is relevant, to folks that are either, just now moving here or really aren't the outdoorsy type. But for the most part, right, if folks that have been embedded here in Alaska, we're probably preaching to the choir, because I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that do it. But yeah, absolutely. Like, don't be afraid to do it. Take risks with your kids. I know that's kind of been a motto in my own mind for the longest time, is take risks, calculated risk with the kiddos, because I think that that teaches them a lot, and allows them to mature in a lot of cool ways.
And also, if you're not sure, start off your adventures by going on highly populated trails, on easier things. You don't always have to climb Matanuska with your young child. You go to Hatcher's Pass. There are some easy hikes out there that you don't have to worry about wildlife. It's in easier terrain. See if they like the outdoors first. There's plenty of family-friendly hikes that you can go on. You can do parts of Flat Top, I believe, that a lot of people do with their families. And yeah, there's plenty out there to find out if they like it. So it's not like you got to jump into the hardest thing. Just get out there. For those families that are, like you said, that are new to the area, you're never going to know unless you try it.
Yep. Yeah, and I mentioned it in my kind of the welcoming episode, if you will, but there's something here in Alaska for everybody. Again, from some of the smaller stuff like the Butte and Palmer to Denali and everything in between. So get out there and do it. So, well, cool. Allie, wife, again, thank you for spending the time with me tonight to do an episode. It's really cool to hear that perspective again from somebody who's kind of a casual hiker and stuff. So, and hopefully the listeners kind of enjoy that perspective as well. So again, thanks for your time, and appreciate you. Love you.
It's my pleasure. Love ya.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please take a few minutes to like, subscribe, drop a comment, or leave a rating on whatever platform you are using to support the podcast and to reach more current and aspiring climbers. As a reminder, if you would like to connect with other climbers, hikers, and mountaineers, consider joining the Mountaineering Club of Alaska at mtnclubak.org. Although mountaineering can sometimes be an individual journey and challenge in itself, there is also something very profound about talking and sharing those experiences with those alike. That's exactly why I started this podcast, to simply connect. This podcast has been produced by myself, and original music has been provided by Emberloom. I am your host, Sean Kortus. Thanks for listening, and safe climbing.